Welcome to another Make and Do with June. Today we're going to be making a 3D card, Moonlight Serenade, with these adorable frogs from Jane F Hankins, and you can find them at janefhankins.com. We will be using the Pastel pencils, and I will list the colors down below along with PanPastels, a Posca white marker, a tape runner, some scissors, and some sticky dots. Here we go. Let's get started. So first of all, I'm going to take one card and I'm going to color in just the frogs. So I'm going to speed it up a little so that you can watch what I do, but go ahead and color the frogs as you wish. First, I start off by coloring with a light green, and I just go all over the frogs. I leave a little bit of their belly just as a highlight, so it looks nice and round because they are nice and round. And then I will go back in and color with darker shades. So remember, we are just coloring the frogs. These frogs are so cute, playing their music in their little string quartet. This is also in one of Jane F Hankins' books. The book is titled A Celebration of Night Magic from the Imaginary World of Jane F Hankins. It has 25 pages and currently comes in a 9 by 12 and 11 by 14 and can be found on her website as well, janefhankins.com. I'll supply a link down below, but you can look it up. There's lots of great books on that site. Now I'm going to use this gray-green to add some shading to the outside edges of the frogs. Now I'm going to use this mustard color to color in the spots on the frogs. Okay, now let's add a little bit of pink to their mouths. And I'm sure frogs don't have pink mouths, but these do. So we're going to color them in. I add a little bit of yellow. And then I use this eraser to take some of the color off. And it helps make the stomachs look a little bit rounder by removing some of that color. Okay, after a few yellow highlights on the lips, I'm going to color in his little banjo. And right now I'm just going over it with this mustardy color, and then I'll go in later and add a few highlights to it. Oh, I have to give them eyes. So of course they have green eyes. They are frogs after all. And then I add a little bit of green to the outside edge of their mouths. Okay, I'm going to quickly color in the two little frogs at the top. And then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, jump ahead to the little frogs colored in. Give them a little bit of pink around their mouths. And I love to add little rosy cheeks to all of Jane's critters, creatures, people, everything in her book, even the flowers. I don't know. That's just my favorite thing to do. I've seen these frogs done where somebody added teeth, and they were just adorable. Okay, now that the little frogs are colored, grab your scissors. We're going to tear the front cover off, or you could cut it off, use a paper trimmer or whatever. And now I'm just roughly cutting around the outside edge. Okay, so carefully cut around the outside edge. Make sure that you don't tear the paper. Sometimes you have to come at it from two different angles so that you can get the little piece out of there. And when I say that, it's like this one. I trimmed it from the top and then the bottom. And here again. Sorry, I keep going out of the camera. It's hard for me to cut with my arms straight out. Okay, now I just want to focus on trimming around the top part of this. their arms and legs are really tiny here, so just be careful that you don't accidentally cut too far through. I left some white from the background just to make sure that the little pieces stay intact and don't accidentally get torn off. And also, when you put the card in an envelope, you want to make sure that it doesn't leave behind a little arm in there. So leave some white space in the back. Just trim around the best you can. And make sure that, you just want it to look nice, but it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. And I'm going to show you a trick here in a minute once I get done cutting. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done cutting. Okay, here are my 4 little guys all cut out. I am going to use a black pen. This is a felt tip pen, and it's a real fine point pen. And I'm just going around those outside edges where it's still a little white, and either drawing on some black lines or just touching the outside edge of the paper. And what that does is it hides any small bits of white paper that's still left behind. Because remember, it's hard to cut, and you don't have to be perfect. This is kind of a way to cover up some of those imperfections and just finish it off so that the white isn't showing on the side. Okay, here they are all done and ready to go. I'll move that piece out of the way. I grab a second card and my colors that I want to use for the background, and I color just the background on this part. So I'm coloring in the cattails with that mustard color again, and I'll be layering different colors of green. I'll be coloring the sky, the moon, and the little froggies in the background. Using a light green, I start coloring the little frogs that are in the water. I always start with a lighter shade first. And once you get done coloring with the lighter shade, you can go back in and do some highlights with a darker green. It's up to you, you decide. I'm using the Cadmium Green Deep for the lily pads, just coloring them in quickly. Then I'm using the Grenadine Light for the pink flowers, and then I'm going to go over them with a Venetian Red, which is a nice bright orange red to make those flowers pop. The leaves to the cattails, I start with a castle green, and it is basically mid-tone green. Make sure that you keep your tips nice and sharp to get into those small spaces. Because I'm a lefty, I have a tendency to not let my hand rest on the paper, and so I flip it around. You do whatever works for you. Here I'm using a yellow ochre to do some highlights onto those leaves, and just going over the castle green that I used previously. And then I have this kind of a lime green, which is the Cadmium Green Light. And that just makes those colors pop for the background. They stand out a lot more, and you can just see by looking at this how it really adds to the color of these leaves. Okay, now I colored this moon yellow, and I decided after the fact that it was just a little bit too much yellow. So I took my white eraser and went over it a few times, just lightly, lifting up some of that color. And then I was a little more happy with my moon. Filling in the stars. And then I'm going to move on to work on the background. Okay, now on to the backgrounds. So I'm using PanPastels for these backgrounds, and the applicators are made for PanPastels. They are very much like makeup brushes. They are called Sofft, Sofft, and they go on just like you were applying makeup. I go over all of the background first with this lighter blue, which is Phthalo Blue Tint. And you don't need to worry about going over the penciled in part where you've colored with the pencils, because the pencils have a wax base to them. They actually resist this pastel, and then I'll show you how to lift it off in just a little bit. So now I'm using the Phthalo Blue shade as the darker blue to fill in the night sky. And you can see where I'm going over a lot of what I had already colored, and you don't need to worry about that. Also, when I dab off my brush, it leaves behind enough where you can go back in and pick up a little bit of that and continue using it. So here I'm going to use a white eraser, and they are basically a rubber eraser, but just carefully touching in the areas that I don't want the PanPastels, and you just brush over it quickly with the eraser and it takes it right off. And then if you take off a little bit too much, just go back in, a little bit of touch up, and you're good to go. So I'm going to erase a little bit more in here, and don't worry about covering up the frogs underneath because we're going to be covering them up with the first piece that we did. So I add some highlights around the stars, around the little mosquitoes, around the moon, and of course the clouds. So a little more touch up, and here I used the wrong side of the brush, which actually had some gray on it, and it wasn't quite the same blue that I had hoped for, and I tried to take a little bit of it off, but it didn't work. So sometimes that happens, got to pay attention to what you're doing, but it is what it is, and I'm moving on. So now I'm going to color the water, and again, don't worry about the previously colored parts with the pencil or the frogs underneath. In fact, if you color a little bit more onto the frogs underneath, it helps the top piece blend with the background. Okay, just a little more touch up, and I'm going to color in the lily pad, starting with a mid-range green, going over it lightly first, coloring in all the white space. And don't worry about getting it on the frogs underneath again. This is where it's kind of nice because you can just color really fast. Then I go over it again with a little more pencil pressure. Fill it in. And then I'm using my Terra Verde, the gray-green, to add some shadows to the outside edges. And the areas where there is black cross hatching, which is Jane's way of showing where the shading should happen. So I go over that, just blending it in, anywhere that you think that the frog would cast a shadow. Then I go over it with the yellow ochre to make that color even more bright. Kind of brings it to life, so to speak. Okay, now this yellow looks pretty good, but I want to blend these colors together. I'm going to use a Prismacolor Blending Pen, and notice that off to my right there, I take and brush the pen real quick. I'm just checking to make sure that there isn't any additional color on that pen tip. I use it often, and I just want to make sure that I don't have some red on there or some other color that's going to muddy up the work I just did. So as you can see, when you go over it with the blending pen, it just moves those colors together a little bit nicer. Now I'm going to add some color to the eyes of the frogs. And almost done with the card. Gotta add those rosy cheeks. Okay, and just a little more touch up in the background. Got to make sure that I have the right side of that blue. Trying to fix that gray spot again, and it kind of works. So I go over it, making my sky a little bit darker. Filling in the edges, and you don't have to be perfect just yet. And I'm going to show you how to make it look a little more perfect here in just a second. So I take my white eraser. Actually, the smaller one on a pencil is easier to use because for me, I can get a straighter line. But I add it to a pencil and just go up one side and down the other, and notice how it just erases beautifully. So I can get a nice straight edge there. Now I'm going to use my sticky foam squares, and I'm not too sure where I got these. It could have been Hobby Lobby, it could have been the Dollar Tree, I'm not sure. I've had them for a while, I use them often. But anyhow, they are to add dimension to the picture, and it's how we're going to stick our cutout piece on top of this card. Make sure that you place several around so that every bit is lifted up. If you don't use enough, you're going to end up with your design collapsing either in the middle or getting torn off or something like that. So I pull off the little paper tips, line up my frogs, stick them on, make sure that they are all lined up nice and neatly. And I've got one little foam square sticking out, and I just use a little sharp pair of scissors to poke it back in. Now I'm going to use that blue that I used for the background and just touch up some of the spots that are still white. There's little bubbles on the end of his banjo, and I color those in blue, add a few highlights to the banjo, and the top of the littlest frog. Now I'm using my white Posca fine liner to put some highlights in their eyes, and I add the highlights to the frog's eyes in the water, some of the water to show the reflection from the moon, and a little white on the bubbles. You can add it wherever you want. It's entirely up to you. And there's our little card. And I could continue touching up. Seems like I'm never quite done. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Hit that bell so that you get notified of all the new ones that I upload. And have fun making your cards. Bye-bye.